if acronyms have ever made security feel like a private club with its own language. This is where that feeling starts to go away. The Global Information Assurance Certification, GIAC, Security Operations Manager, GSOM, content expects you to read and think quickly, and acronyms can slow you down if you treat them like random letters you must memorize. The trick is to hear each acronym as a compressed idea, because most acronyms are shorthand for roles, processes, measurements, or technologies that you already understand once they are expanded. That is why this review is not about dumping a giant alphabet soup into your brain, but about giving you a clean way to decode, categorize, and recall the acronyms that show up often in security operations management. When you learn them as a structured vocabulary, acronyms stop being a barrier and become a speed advantage, because you can recognize a concept instantly and move on to the decision the question is actually testing. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to begin is by noticing that most security acronyms fall into a few predictable families, and each family tends to appear in certain types of exam questions. Some acronyms name operational functions, such as incident response, IR, because the exam frequently tests how organizations handle problems over time and under pressure. Some acronyms name platforms and tooling categories, such as security information and event management, SIEM, and endpoint detection and response, EDR, because the exam expects you to know what these systems do at a high level and how they support operations. Other acronyms describe governance and measurement, such as Service Level Agreement, SLA, and Key Performance Indicator, KPI, because management work is measured and communicated. There are also acronyms that describe identity and access concepts, such as Identity and Access Management, IAM, and Multi-Factor Authentication, MFA, because identity is a common attack path and a common control focus. Once you see these families, you stop trying to memorize letters in isolation and instead attach each acronym to the kind of decision it influences. When you encounter an acronym in a question, your first job is to translate it into a plain language role in the story the question is telling. Security operations questions are almost always story problems, even when they look technical, because they involve goals, constraints, and choices. If you see SIEM, you should immediately think centralized event collection, correlation, and alerting, not a specific vendor product or a specific screen. If you see EDR, you should think endpoint visibility, detection of suspicious behavior on devices, and the ability to support investigation and containment actions at the endpoint layer. If you see security orchestration, automation, and response, SOAR, you should think workflow, automation, and coordination, which is especially relevant to reducing manual effort and improving consistency under volume. That mental translation keeps you from getting trapped in the letters and helps you focus on what the exam is evaluating, which is whether you can choose the most defensible operational action. Over time, this becomes automatic, and the acronym becomes a mental shortcut rather than a speed bump. Another family you should be comfortable with is the set of acronyms that describe evidence and threat signals, because a SOC lives and dies by how it interprets information. Threat intelligence, TI, should immediately signal information used to guide priorities and hypotheses, not proof that an incident is occurring. Tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTP, should signal attacker behavior patterns, which are often more durable than specific artifacts. Indicator of compromise, IOC, should signal a concrete observable that can support detection and investigation, like a suspicious value or artifact, while still requiring context to avoid false conclusions. User and Entity Behavior Analytics, UEBA, should signal a behavior-focused analytic approach that tries to identify unusual actions relative to baselines, often used to catch subtle misuse that signature detections miss. When you hear these acronyms, connect them to the idea of confidence, because evidence quality determines whether you validate, escalate, or contain. In exam terms, the best answer often reflects this evidence discipline. meaning it uses intelligence to guide attention, but still demands verification before disruptive action. Because security operations management is deeply tied to time and performance, measurement acronyms are especially high yield, and beginners often misunderstand what they truly represent. Mean time to detect, MTTD, is not a magic number that proves you are secure, but a way to understand how quickly meaningful activity is recognized after it begins. Mean time to respond, MTTR, is often used to describe how quickly the organization can take effective action after detection, though people sometimes confuse it with recovery, which is not always the same thing. Key risk indicator, KRI, should make you think about conditions that signal risk posture, such as visibility gaps or unresolved high-risk exposures, while KPI signals performance of processes like triage timeliness and investigation completion. Root cause analysis, RCA, is a structured way to understand why an issue occurred and what systemic changes prevent recurrence, and it ties directly to continuous improvement after incidents. These acronyms matter because they connect operations to leadership expectations, and the exam tends to reward decisions that improve repeatability and measurement rather than decisions that merely feel heroic. If you can explain what each metric tells you and what it does not tell you, you will avoid choosing answers that misuse numbers to justify weak reasoning. Identity and access acronyms show up frequently because identity is both a control plane and a common attacker objective, and the exam expects you to understand identity at a management level. IAM is the umbrella concept that includes how identities are created, how permissions are granted, and how access is reviewed and controlled over time. Role-based access control, RBAC, is a method of granting permissions based on roles, which supports predictable access patterns and reduces ad hoc privilege sprawl. Attribute-based access control, ABAC, is a more flexible approach that uses attributes like context, device posture, or other conditions to make access decisions, which can support finer-grained policy but also adds complexity. MFA is one of the most common protections against credential theft, but it is not a cure-all because attackers can still exploit human behavior and session weaknesses in some scenarios. When you see these acronyms, connect them to the principle of least privilege and to monitoring, because strong access design reduces blast radius, while good visibility helps detect misuse. A management-focused answer often balances access restrictions with operational feasibility, because access control that is too rigid can be bypassed or can harm business outcomes. Data protection acronyms also appear because operational leaders must understand what is being protected and what controls reduce exposure when other layers fail. Data loss prevention, DLP, signals a control strategy focused on preventing sensitive data from leaving approved boundaries, often through monitoring and enforcement of data handling policies. Encryption often appears alongside key management concepts, and while encryption itself is not an acronym in the same way, you will frequently see Key Management Service, KMS, in environments that use managed keys, which ties to governance and access boundaries. Data classification language might appear without a single acronym, but the idea often connects to controls like DLP and to logging, because it informs what access is high risk and what actions require stronger review. In operational terms, data protection acronyms tend to show up in questions about prioritization, because you must know which data is sensitive and what events around that data should trigger escalation. A mature understanding includes the idea that data controls are not only about blocking exfiltration, but also about reducing accidental exposure through misconfiguration and overbroad access. When you mentally translate these acronyms, treat them as tools for limiting impact, because impact control is a core part of defensible architecture and incident response planning. Governance and standards acronyms can feel intimidating because they are broad, but you do not need to recite entire documents to use them correctly in exam reasoning. National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, often signals a structured approach to cybersecurity practices and risk management, and it is frequently referenced as a source of common language for controls and program structure. International Organization for Standardization, ISO, often signals management systems and standardization approaches used across industries, especially when organizations need evidence and repeatability. Center for Internet Security, CIS, often signals practical control guidance and baseline hardening approaches that organizations use to reduce common weaknesses. When these acronyms appear, the exam is usually testing whether you understand that governance is about repeatable processes, evidence, and alignment with risk, not about memorizing document section numbers. It is also testing whether you can choose actions that create defensible outcomes, such as improving logging, tightening access, or documenting response procedures. If you treat standards acronyms as signals for structured, evidence-based program decisions, you will interpret questions in the way they were designed. Some acronyms matter because they shape how planning decisions are made under time constraints, especially when recovery and resilience are involved. Business Continuity Plan, BCP, signals the organization's strategy for continuing critical operations during disruption, while Disaster Recovery, DR, signals restoring systems and services after a major failure event. Recovery Time Objective, RTO, signals how quickly a service must be restored after disruption, while Recovery Point Objective, RPO, signals how much data loss is acceptable in time terms, which influences backup strategies and system design. These acronyms show up when the exam wants you to connect incident response decisions to business impact, because containment and recovery decisions often involve trade-offs between speed, completeness, and disruption. If you see RTO and RPO, do not treat them as abstract definitions, because they are constraints that determine how aggressive response can be and how quickly the organization must shift into recovery mode. A strong answer usually respects these constraints and uses them to justify prioritization, such as focusing first on restoring the most critical service even if lower priority systems remain offline. When you recall these acronyms fluently, planning questions become easier because you can immediately see what success means for the business. Operational communication and escalation often includes acronyms that represent structured expectations, and the exam may test whether you understand how those expectations influence staffing and coverage. SLA is not just a contract term, because in a SOC context it often translates into time targets for triage, escalation, and response. When a scenario suggests strict time expectations, you should think about whether the current coverage model and staffing can realistically meet them. Another frequent idea is severity, SEV, which is sometimes used in organizations to label priority levels. And even when the acronym does not appear explicitly, the concept of severity classification drives consistent triage. The key point is that operational acronyms often represent agreements about behavior, not just labels, and those agreements are what keep teams coordinated under stress. If you treat these acronyms as commitments rather than as vocabulary, you will naturally ask the right questions, such as what triggers escalation and who has authority for disruptive actions. This also helps you avoid common mistakes, like escalating too early without evidence or escalating too late because of uncertainty, when the risk profile indicates that time matters. Acronym fluency here becomes decision fluency, which is exactly what exam scenarios are designed to measure. Now consider how acronyms can create traps in exam questions, not because the exam is unfair, but because it expects you to notice when letters are being used to distract you from the real decision. One trap is assuming that a platform acronym automatically implies a correct action, such as believing that adding SOAR automation is always the best response to alert fatigue. Another trap is treating intelligence acronyms like IOC as proof rather than as a clue, which can lead to overly disruptive containment steps without validation. A third trap is treating governance acronyms like NIST as a reason to produce documents instead of improving operational outcomes, when the scenario is clearly about detection and response effectiveness. The way to avoid these traps is to translate the acronym into its functional purpose and then ask whether that purpose fits the scenario's goal and constraints. If the scenario is about slow triage due to lack of context, improving data enrichment and workflow may matter more than adding a new platform layer. If the scenario is about high-impact risk on critical assets, escalation and containment discipline may matter more than adding additional dashboards. When you focus on purpose, you treat acronyms as cues rather than as commands. Because this is an audio reference, it helps to build a memory habit that keeps acronyms consistent and retrievable without turning study into rote memorization. One useful habit is to attach each acronym to a single, plain language sentence you can say quickly, such as SIEM means centralized event collection and correlation for alerting, or IAM means controlling identities and permissions across systems. Another habit is to attach each acronym to the kind of decision it supports, such as MTTD and MTT are supporting performance measurement and improvement discussions, or RTO and RPO supporting continuity and recovery planning. The value of these habits is that they reduce cognitive load, meaning you do not spend mental energy decoding letters when you should be choosing an answer. They also reduce the risk of confusing similar-looking acronyms because each one lives in a clear category with a clear purpose. Over time, these sentences become mental shortcuts that make your reading speed faster and your reasoning steadier. In a timed exam context, that steadiness is a real performance advantage. It is also important to remember that acronyms can differ slightly across organizations, so the exam typically emphasizes the common meaning rather than niche internal variations. That is why you should focus on what the acronym represents in function, not on how a single company might implement it. For example, SIEM platforms vary widely, but their role in collecting, normalizing, correlating, and alerting on events is a stable idea. EDR products vary, but their role in endpoint visibility and response support is stable. SOAR implementations differ, but their purpose of orchestrating workflows and automation is stable. The exam is testing whether you can reason about how these categories fit together, such as how SIEM and EDR alerts might feed triage workflows and how automation might reduce repetitive tasks while increasing consistency. If you hold the stable functional meaning, you will not get distracted by tool-specific imagination. That keeps your answers grounded in operational logic, which is what management-focused questions reward. As you build confidence, you should also notice how acronym families connect, because the exam often blends multiple categories in a single scenario. A question might involve identity compromise, so IAM and MFA ideas connect to detection through SIEM alerts and to response decisions that must meet an SLA. Another question might involve resilience, so BCP, DR, RTO, and RPO connect to incident response coordination and to leadership communication. Another question might involve program improvement, so KPI, KRI, MTTD, and MTT are connect to tuning detections, reducing alert fatigue, and demonstrating progress in a defensible way. When you hear these acronyms as connected pieces, you stop treating the scenario as a set of separate definitions and instead see an operational system. That systems view is exactly what security operations management is about, because real programs succeed when people, process, and technology reinforce each other. Acronyms are simply the shorthand labels for those system components, and the exam expects you to recognize how they interact. To close this review, keep the main goal in mind, which is that acronyms should speed up your thinking, not slow it down, and the only way that happens is if each acronym immediately activates a clear concept. If you can translate a platform acronym into what it does, translate a measurement acronym into what it tells you, and translate a governance acronym into what kind of structured decision it supports, you will move through questions with far less friction. You do not need to chase every rare acronym, because high-yield success comes from mastering the common vocabulary and using it to understand scenarios quickly. Treat each acronym as a compressed sentence about function and purpose, then let the scenario tell you which functions matter most. When you practice this consistently, you will find that acronyms become one of the easiest parts of the exam rather than one of the most annoying. That shift is the point of this episode, because a shared language is what allows a SOC program to plan, communicate, and execute reliably under pressure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.